tell me your name.
I am Terese Schaad,
Okay. And when and where were you born?
and I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, on the 28th of November in 1924. The first child.
Okay. And who were your parents?
And my parents were Ella, Quinn, Joyce, and Martin Francis Joyce.
Okay. And did you have any siblings?
And I had one sister that is 27 months younger than I am, and there were just the two of us.
Okay. We're discussing the changing technology in your life and new technological innovations that you remember in your lifetime so far. So let's start with refrigeration. You had an ice box first.
Yes, and that was kept downstairs in the basement, and maybe every other day or so in the summertime. The iceman would come along in his truck, and we would have a little sign out on the window of our front window, and it would say ice. And so then the man would know enough to stop and then to bring the ice around to the back and downstairs and put usually either 25 or maybe 50 pounds, but the box did not hold any more than 50 pounds. And that was up at the top. And then the down part of it, and it couldn't have been any more than about, maybe 2 feet wide. Not quite 3 feet deep. And that's where all the butter and things that, perishable things like butter and eggs and things like that would be kept.
During the winter time?
And in the wintertime we had what we called a window box. And that was a box about the size, it fit into the kitchen, the window over the kitchen sink. And it was probably maybe about 18, 20 inches deep, and probably as high as the first, you had a pull-up window, and so it would be and all the eggs and butter, milk, and things were kept in there, and it was cold enough that the food wouldn't spoil.
Why did you have an ice box as opposed to a refrigerator?
Well, Mary Rose was born while we were living in Fairview Village. And so my father was still getting fairly good jobs. We also had chances when he would work out of town. And so there wasn't really any need for an electric refrigerator until one time my Aunt Josephine, who lived on the east side of Cleveland, had an opportunity to buy a more modern refrigerator. And so she gave us their old box, and it was an Electrolux. It was probably twice the size of the little ice box that was downstairs, and much higher. And it held, it had 3 or 4 compartments, and held all different kinds of food and things like that. It was, my father had to drill a hole into the bottom through the floor, and then downstairs was this big motor type thing with a belt that went around a wheel and up and around. And when that thing would start, it nearly shook the house. It was so noisy, but now that was probably one of the first Electroluxes that came into Cleveland.
About what year did you get it?
We got it, let me see, I was in probably 34, 35, something like that. Because I remember my father had to go to the east side to get it, and he had borrowed a truck. And he brought the truck home, parked it in our backyard after a lot of maneuvering and everything. And then, I don't remember who helped him unload the refrigerator. And then the truck was place to climb in and on and around and everything. And me, who they called Careful Katie, managed to get her leg caught in the, what do you call it, tailgate that had been open this way, and I got my leg caught right in the middle of it. I had had a bruise or a scrape on my knee before that, and apparently got an infection from this dirty old truck, and spent the rest of the summer in bed with a really bad infection in my leg. And my grandfather, who had been was a battalion chief of the fire department back in the days when they had horses, and they used a medicine called chinosol to put on the horses' sores and things. Well, Grandpa used it on human beings too, and he insisted that my mother buy some and put in. I had poluses on my knee, and it finally cured it, but it was to the point where she was afraid maybe she was going to have to call a doctor. And back in those days, you didn't call a doctor unless you were at death's door, and especially if, as my mother was a nurse, she could take care of anything. So
Let's talk about the assortment and availability of foods in Ohio when you were a young person.
now we lived west of town. We lived in a little suburb called Fairview Village, and it was a farming area out west of town, and we could buy fresh fruit and vegetables on the little wayside stands. They also had a man come around with fruits and vegetables and things like that, and he would drive slowly down the street, and the housewife would go out, and he'd stop, and then you pick out the different kinds of vegetables and things like that you wanted. Now, my father had a small garden. He grew corn, and he grew asparagus and some tomatoes and beans and things like that. And we had a couple of raspberry bushes, and a pear tree and a peach tree. And so my mother always canned a lot of fruits, and made probably the most delicious grape jelly that you've ever tasted in your life. Strawberry jelly, strawberry jam, and raspberry. She used to make preserve, I suppose you'd call it, called Heavenly Hash, and it had quince and 2 or 3 different kinds of raspberries and everything that she could get. I think she really made it up out of her head, because it had such a variety of different kinds of fruits, and it was out of this world.
And so you had to can all your vegetables
Yeah,
for the winter.
yeah. In the winter time, the grocery stores had, now you could buy potatoes and the various root type of vegetables, because they they stored in the winter time and everything. But fresh vegetables, you could never ever eat lettuce in the winter time, or tomatoes, or anything like that would be considered, even celery. No salad foods of any kind, because it just was impossible. They did not have the refrigeration to preserve those things over the winter.
But you were telling me that things changed after World War II and that.
Yes. Now, I don't know when Birdseye began making frozen foods, and I think probably one of the first frozen food that Birdseye put out that were accepted by the housewife were green peas. And because when I was in college, I was a home ec student, and we had a representative from Birdseye come to tell us about this new thing that they were putting out. And of course, then after the war, Birdseye and then Green Giant and all the others made it really work so that now you can just get about any kind of a vegetable or a fruit frozen and all year round. And of course they do have now fresh fruits and vegetables because of the refrigeration in the trucks, that they can bring things from California to New York and so forth.
Okay. So those frozen foods, they were contained in plastic?
No, they were cardboard carton that was waxed, similar to the cartons that they began making and selling with milk. Before that, you had a glass container for your milk, and then I think they used that waxed cardboard for what they called oleo margarine, and it was a butter substitute that was white, looked like what do I want to say, that white stuff? Anyhow, and they had a little yellow packet that went with it, and you sprinkled that in there, and then you with your hands squished it all up and mixed it all into it. And I thought that was the best funny thing. You know, I always wanted my mother to buy some oleo rather than butter, but my mother was smart enough to know that butter was better for you, and oleo was just a substitute for butter. But that, I think, is when the cartons began with that type of butter substitute, and then they sold butter in a carton that had that wax on, and then they sold the frozen food like that, and then the milk. And then by that time, after the war, milk was homogenized or skim. It wasn't like we used to have when I was a little girl, that the milkman would bring me the milk early in the morning, and if it was cold enough, the cream at the top of the bottle of milk would freeze, and if it froze, it rose a little bit, and maybe the cap that went on the top would be maybe about an inch and a half, 2 inches above the top of the milk bottle. And my sister and I always called that ice cream. And my mother would sometimes give us a little tiny bit of it to put on our cereal or something. We thought that was real good.
Tell me about the introduction of plastics. You were telling me that you had a doll made of celluloid when you were little.
Yes, they made all. Now I have one doll that its face and hands, arms, and part of its legs are made of. It's a form of celluloid. Then they make the little tiny dolls and other kinds of like trucks and things like that. Little small things. The other toy trucks and so forth were made of metal, but they would be made of this celluloid. And I remember once having a little baby doll, and it fell, and someone stepped on it and cracked its face and everything because it was very brittle, and you could cut yourself on it. It was really, now when everyone is so conscious of the hazards of toys, it would not have been approved to be used as a toy because when it broke, it was very, very sharp.
I want to cover communication systems now. Can you please describe the first radio you remember? And I believe we have a picture of that.
Yes, this picture right here, I don't know whether you can zero in on it or not. It had this big horn, like this is where the sound came out. And then you had to adjust all these tubes and everything. There wasn't any definite, say, channel for various stations because they were not powerful enough back in those days as far out of Cleveland we lived. And I remember my father bringing this thing home and setting it all up and everything. It took probably 3 or 4 feet of surface. And he finally got a station, and we listened to George Burns and Gracie Allen on, I think that, as far as I can remember, is my first recollection of any kind of a program, and it was George Burns and Gracie Allen.
Okay. Do you remember when your family got your first television?
Yes, we had.
What year?
We had gone from this original radio to other small radios and big radios of Philco and a few other things. And then we moved to Florida. My father was in the electrical appliance business as well as contracting.
What year did you move?
And we moved to Florida in 1945, and it was probably about 47 or 48 that he was able to order a television. We were probably one of the first people in Lake Worth, Florida to own a television. And of course, all our friends had to come and see it and viewed the various programs and things that were on. Now I know there was television before, probably in New York and Cleveland and places like bigger cities, but in Florida and right after the war, when all appliances were hard to come by, we were probably one of the first in that area to have a television.
What did you think of it? I mean, this was now.
Well, now I'll tell you. I used to read the funny papers, and there was a cartoon called Pam, or something like that. I remember. But anyhow, this heroine had a boyfriend who was working for the FBI or something, and they had invented an appliance or an instrument that they called television. And of course this was a way out thing. No one ever thought that it could possibly be a real happening, just like Buck Rogers. But
when did you get your first color TV?
well, I think the color TV came probably after we were married and could afford a color TV. But my father and mother had one before that.
Did the popularity of TVs affect radio listening and radio programming?
Well, yes, I think it did to a great extent. We used to listen, even when we had a television, we used to listen to various programs on the radio. And when you were listening to a program on the radio, you used your own imagination as to what the characters looked like. And I'm sure if there were 5 people listening, every character looked different to every person. And they had some pretty interesting shows. Not so much just music like they have nowadays. They had Ma Perkins and My Gal Sal and all these various, what was then called soap operas. And you used your imagination to picture the various things that was going on. And then, of course, when the television became popular enough that enough people had them, then they made regular movie shows like of them. But before that, the only time you'd see anything would be at your movies, and then you didn't, of course, have to use your imagination. You could see what that person looked like.
Tell me your feelings about rockets and manned space flights. You were telling me about Buck Rogers.
Well, now, as I say, I used to be a very great fan of Buck Rogers. We used to listen to it was on right either before or after Orphan Annie and Jack Armstrong and a few other 15-minute programs in the afternoon around between 4 and 5 o'clock, probably while my mother was getting supper ready, while we'd listen to the radio. And Buck Rogers was 500 years into the future, and he had been found when the earth was practically demolished or something, and then he was revived after 500 years, and then became a worker or a student of this Dr. Hewer, or whatever his name, anyhow, and his assistant was Wilma. And they used to zoom around the world and various planets and so forth in these rocket ships. Now this, of course, was all complete imagination. You just couldn't possibly do it. The airplanes were still in a pretty rickety sort of a way. I had, and I can't find it, a picture of myself on this old, well, it's probably one of the latest models of airplanes, because we lived near the Cleveland airport. But the airplane itself was not, hadn't gotten to the point where it could jet through the air like they do now. And so when they started and they talked about space technology and how they were going to put these rockets into the air, into space, and out of our system, and make them, some of them, the satellites would be up in the air for years. Then they talked about putting a man in one of these rockets. I think Russia had put a monkey in one of them and had brought it back alive. And I think that was probably when the United States decided, well, if Russia can put a monkey in there, we can put a man. And I remember watching it on television, because Cape Canaveral was not too far, maybe a couple 100 miles from Lake Worth. And I think the second time they lifted off, we went out in our backyard and we could see the rocket going out over the ocean. And then we watched avidly. We watched every time there was a launching of any sort or other. And we would read in the newspaper where people just would not believe that man could go out into space and then go around the Earth and come back, and with pictures and to tell. They just thought that that was all somebody's imagination, more like something out of Buck Rogers. But then we have a brother-in-law that lived in Titusville, and when they shot that one off to the moon, we were there to see that lift off from. We were on the other side of the lake or river, but we did see that one lift off into space, and that was quite an experience for all of us. And I believe now that maybe because we've moved here to North Carolina, we're not quite as interested. I don't think that people pay as much attention to all the various liftoff. I believe that when that one spacecraft burst into flames and disintegrated.
When was that? Are you talking about the space shuttle?
Yeah, the space shuttle. We saw that. We were in Florida at the time, and we were going up the A1A, I believe it was, and we saw this thing go off, and we said, we were in the car, and we said, "Oh, that must be the space shuttle." And then all of a sudden, there was this big explosion, and then you could see particles falling down, and we thought, "Oh no, that can't possibly be it." But by the time we got, then we turned on the radio, the car radio, and they said that the space shuttle had exploded, and that they were afraid that all those on board were lost and everything. But we actually saw that with our own eyes, that burst into space. And it was a tremendous shock. And then I think it made people more aware of the fact that every time one goes off, it's a chance. We're still experimenting after 15 or 20 years. And I think they're now becoming, again, more interested in the various liftoffs and things like that. People are beginning to watch it more again. They took it for granted there for a while, which is what we do a lot of things.
Can you tell me about the differences of sewing machines that you've worked on throughout the years?
Well, yes. My mother had an old Singer sewing machine, and I'm trying to remember. I think it was the pedal type that you used to. The power was with your foot. My Aunt Josephine, who was the seamstress in our family, had an old one, and she had it electrified, and they had to have a special motor along the side, and then there was a knee pedal attached to the bottom part of it. They still kept the foot pedal thing, but you didn't use that. That was eliminated. But then gradually they got to the point where the electricity was then made right into the sewing machine itself. When we moved to Florida, my sister was still going to college, and we needed to sew her some clothes. Could not find a sewing machine because this was right after the war. And this lady, Mrs. Valcourt, her name was, a very old lady, said that we could borrow her sewing machine. And it was probably one of the original Singers, and it had a shuttle that was probably about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches long, and there was a sewing machine repair store in Lake Worth where you could still buy some of those shuttles, and you had to push the thing, and you felt like you were imagining driving a train. You wanted to go woo woo with it, you know, because it just, but it had the most beautiful stitch, probably nicer than some of the new ones that they have today.
Okay. We've got several pictures here of automobiles. This one right here, this one here, and this one here. Why don't you tell us certainly about your first experiences in riding in them, and then telling us about learning how to drive.
This one was a Model A. I think Model Ts were the first ones out, and then Model A. And I don't remember too much about it because I was only 3 or 4 years old at the time. Then we had another one that I believe was a Studebaker that we would get one, every other year or so.
Keep it still.
We would get a new machine, and each time it would be a little bit fancier and nicer. And one time we had the car parked in the garage. My father was going to teach my mother to drive. My mother got into the car, closed the door. My father got on the passenger side, but forgot to close the door. And when my mother backed out of the garage, she took the door off. And that was it. She never got back in the driver's seat of the car and never learned to drive. So my father, when he taught my sister and I how to drive, started from outside where he knew that all the parts would still be safe and sound. But we have had new cars right along. I remember as a grade school child, probably, someone in our neighborhood had a small car that had a rumble seat in the back, and that was fun. That was almost like driving in a, what do they call them, the cars that have no...
Convertible?
Convertible. In the rumble seat, you got blown around just as much as you did in the convertibles that they had to.
Tell me about your first driving experiences. You were telling me there's a story about you stalling out and your mother's trying to get out of the car.
Well, I learned to drive when we had been down
What year?
Florida. 42, 43.
So you were how old?
I was about 17, 18. We came back to Cleveland, and we got our, I said we, my sister and I, both got our driver's license, and my sister was off to college, and I was going to college in Cleveland, taking the buses and the streetcars back and forth.
How old did you have to be to get your license?
Had to be 16. And my father was out working out of town, and so I would take my mother up the street about 5 or 6 blocks to the grocery store. And you had to go up and then make a left-hand turn right under a traffic light. And I stalled just as I was turning. And of course the people were beep, 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 beep. That got my mother so upset. She was going to get out of the car, and I grabbed a hold of her and said, "Mother, stay here." And I got the car started, and we went down and parked in front of Fisher's grocery store. And then after that, there was next to Fisher's grocery store, there was a vacant lot. And the street behind that, there was a vacant lot. So my mother would make me drive down that street, park the car down there, and then we would walk up into the vacant lot, do the grocery shopping, and then carry all the groceries back down to the car, and then we would safely go around the corner and drive home again. She never trusted me to go back up onto Lorraine Avenue because she was scared.
So, about what time, say what year, did they start getting things like air conditioning? Did they have radios in the cars at the beginning?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, not in the beginning, I'm sure, because the radios were not all that sure-footed on land, let alone in a moving vehicle. But I'm sure that after, a lot of things happened after or during World War II. We got a lot of new, just like nylon. You couldn't get silk because we were fighting Japan. You couldn't get silk for parachutes. Parachutes were a necessity for bombing missions and things like that. So they developed this nylon, and nylon was used almost exclusively then for war products. Nylon hose for women that had taken the place of the sheer silk. Rayon wasn't as good because it did not hold up. Nylons were the thing. And so after the war, then nylons became the thing. I mean, I don't think you could probably even find a pair of rayon stockings right now. In some areas, maybe cotton stockings are still being used, but mostly it's nylon. Rayon, acetate, and there was a product made of milk, and I cannot remember the name of it, but they made it into a fiber and then wove it into cloth, and it was warm, more of a substitute for wool. Cottons were getting harder to get a hold of too, because we used, besides all the cotton that was grown in the United States, a lot of Egyptian cotton. and because of the war again, you couldn't get those products. So they were trying to invent other types of materials, and this is when the phase, the man-made materials came into existence. And then I think they put the man-made fibers and the natural fibers like cotton and like linen and like wool, combined the two. Wool could then be washed without the chance of it shrinking. Linen was a bit cooler, and it did not wrinkle as fast. Cotton was what we call now wash and wear. You didn't have to iron it so much. These were all things that were developed during the war time for the garments of the soldiers and sailors and Marines and so forth, and also for those people at home. The wool was used in the uniforms, and so we had to have a substitute for the wool to keep us warm here in civilian life. You know, so this all war is bad, but sometimes it gets people off their duffs and brings out inventions that probably otherwise would have been looked down upon.
Tell me about computers in your life. Other than the fact that you don't have one, how do you feel that it's changed your life? You know, you call up and say the computer is down, things like that.
Well, my first experience, I had a little adding machine that was probably then called the first part of a computer. My first experience is when I was working for a Dutch-made clothing manufacturer, and they upped all their office equipment and put in computers. And we were told that had to be under airtight security and all this business, because you couldn't let out air in or out or whatever. And I remember taking a trip to the mill in Ephrata, Pennsylvania.
What year?
And let's see, Mary was born in 62, so it'd be probably 63, 4, something like that. And the doors were closed tightly, and we looked in the windows and looked at these big machines that were the computers. And this was to facilitate all the work that was involved in getting out the orders and everything like that. Now this was strictly then office equipment, and then they began to work in the shipping department. The computers ran all the different the person that was packing a box would just poke a button, and then all these different packages would come from all the different bays and so forth that they had all along and run along down, and that helped a great deal in not making mistakes and things like that. Now I understand that the film industry is almost exclusively run by computers. They even have computers that run the various cameras and things like that. So it's something I think that we should all know more about. I think sometimes I ought to take a course in computers because I talk, but I'm not really sure just how they work and all that sort of thing.
You don't think you're too old?
Well, yeah, maybe that's one of the reasons why I don't go ahead and do it. Or I am so busy, you know.
You said you were raised in the country. You have a picture of your house, and you're going to tell us about the house, and then you're going to talk about the roads.
Yes, this was what they call a bungalow frame house with a cement basement and it had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, kitchen, a living room, and a dining room. And the downstairs, the basement, was where we played on rainy and cold days and roller skated all over the place. It was fun. But we roller skated in the basement of the house because there were no sidewalks or there were no roads, streets, paved streets. The street was all muddy, like similar to the muddy roads that we have in Silva right now in the country way out areas. Then I remember as a child they paved the road and it was mostly cement and it was joined together by tar. And in the real hot summer the tar would bubble up and we would have fun by stepping on it, which didn't do our shoes much good. But anyhow, the road looked like this picture with this car stuck in the middle of it. Then our street was off Lorraine Avenue, which was Route 10, I believe. And that had a streetcar track down the middle of it. And I was probably in maybe the 4th or 5th grade before they took the streetcar tracks. They discontinued making the streetcars out that far and put bus service in. And then they had to take the streetcar tracks out, which caused the road to be that much wider, so that perhaps it was a little bit more than 1 lane going west and 1 lane going east. And then the streetcars were eliminated all through town, and bus service was put into effect. That made the roads a little bit wider. And now in the Cleveland, Ohio area, they've got even 4-lane highways through almost the very center of town. And when we moved to Florida in 1945, the streets were paved more with an asbestos type thing. They had a road called US 1 that went from up north someplace all the way down to Key West. And it was 1 lane going south and 1 lane going north. And I remember driving to Miami many times with just that 1 lane. Then they widened US 1 because the traffic was getting heavier and heavier, especially after the war, when people could buy cars, they could get extra tires, gasoline, things that we never would be able to get unless we were war workers during World War II. Then they started doing a project that was a nationwide project of making an expressway all the way down from Wildwood, which was just a little close to what is now known as Disney World, Orlando, Florida. And the Sunshine Parkway started in Wildwood and went all the way down to the northern part of Miami. And then they have now made it to go all the way down, and it's 4-lane highway all the way down to Key West. Then they built 95, which was between the Sunshine Parkway and US 1. And the Sunshine Parkway is a toll turnpike, and 95 is a free road, a federal road, and it goes now, I think every bit of it is completed, all the way from Miami all the way up into Massachusetts, I believe. There are parts of it that are bypass big cities, and there are parts of it that go right straight through big cities.
So tell me about the house in Florida. It had a solar panel back when you purchased it, or did you?
No,
did you
the
buy
house, we bought this house sight unseen, and one of the things that they brought to our attention, let me see if this takes the wait a minute. Maybe you can see it better without the glare. The we couldn't figure out where the hot water system was. They told us about this solar system, and we didn't know what in the world they were talking about. But on the back of the roof, where the sun would hit it mostly, was a panel that had a glass top on it, and inside were coils of copper tubing that the water ran through. And as it ran slowly through, the sun shining on the glass would heat the water. And there would be enough to do, I would say, maybe 4 or 5 normal showers or baths.
in one day?
In one day. And sometimes even more, sometimes if there'd only be a couple of showers, then you could do your washing with that hot water, and it was hot. And on days when the sun was not shining, like when it rained for 2 or 3 days, or when it was overcast, then the water, after when it started to get cool, then we had an auxiliary. It was a gas water heater, and you switched from the solar system, you turned that off and turned the gas heater on, and then it would heat the water. But solar systems sort of went out for a while after we moved there. There weren't very many of them you'd see in the area. A lot of the plumbers didn't want to be bothered with them. But now, with the price of oil and gas and electricity and so forth, I believe that the solar system, especially for heating water in Florida, but I think it could very well be done up in any area where you get sunshine, and with the beautiful clear air that we have in the mountains, it would be the solution, I believe, to a great problem.
In closing, do you think the technology and the inventions and the innovations that you've seen over your life have improved the standard of living? Do you think overall that basically that they're pretty good?
Yes, I think so. And I believe that with people becoming aware of the dangers of some of our modern inventions, to be aware of the earth and its natural resources, I believe that with our modern day technology and our earth technology, if the combination were brought into effect, we might be able to solve a lot of our problems.
Thank you.